Thank you everybody out there for joining us. It's my pleasure to host this evening's program on behalf of the Huntington Research Division. It's also my privilege to acknowledge that the Huntington exists on the ancestral lands of the Gabrielino, Tongva and Kizh Nation peoples who continue to call this region home. The Huntington respectfully acknowledges these indigenous peoples as the traditional caretakers of this landscape and as the direct descendants of the first people. The Huntington recognizes their continued presence and is grateful for the opportunity to work and to learn on this land. This evening's program is part of the Dibner History of Science program and initiative at the Huntington, which was created through the generosity of the Dibner family in 2006. The program exists for the specific purpose of promoting public awareness of the history of science and technology and of publicizing the Huntington's significant holdings in this field, which are dominated, of course, by the Burndy Library, which in itself was a gift from the Dibner family. The program includes a number of fellowships, of programs, and of resources for exhibitions and other formats. A distinguished fellow is invited to be in residence every other year, and previous distinguished Dibner fellows have included Professors Robert Westman, Ed Russell, Dina Goodman, and Janet Brown. This year's distinguished fellow in residence is Eileen Reeves, Professor of Comparative Literature at Princeton University, where she's taught since 1993. Eileen holds a BA in Literature from Whitman College and a PhD in Comparative Literature from Stanford University. And she's held numerous fellowships across the United States and in Europe at the John Carter Brown Library, the Newberry Library, the Folger Shakespeare Library, the American Academy in Rome, and the Italian Academy of Columbia University. She's the author of 3 monographs: Painting the Heavens, Art and Astronomy in the Age of Galileo, Galileo's Glassworks, The Telescope and the Mirror, and most recently, Evening News, Optics, Astronomy and Journalism in Early Modern Europe. Her Huntington Fellowship project while she's in residence this year is called Galileo's Faithful Shepherd, and it is from that project that tonight's talk is derived. As usual with our Zoom webinar programs, we've pre-recorded the program. So you're about to see the video of Eileen's presentation, including its slide deck. And we encourage you either during or immediately after the video is concluded to use the Q&A function on the right-hand side of your Zoom screen to submit questions. And then we will take the Q&A live. So thank you once again, all of you, for joining us. And Ben will now roll the video for Eileen's Dibner Distinguished Fellows Lecture, Astronomy in Arcadia, Galileo and Guarini's Pastor Fido.
Hello, good evening. It's a pleasure to be here and to talk to you about astronomy in Arcadia, or in shorthand form, why does that satyr on the left hold a telescope rather than panpipes? I'll begin with a fable ascribed to Aesop, and you certainly know its punchline, even if you're not familiar with the images associated with it. These ones here, Galileo himself would have seen. So the story goes like this. A man and a satyr were very good friends. At one point, they're together on a cold day, and the satyr sees the man blowing on his fingers. Why do you do that? Oh, to warm them up. A little bit later, they have a meal. The man is blowing on the meal, and the satyr says, why do you do that? Well, to cool it down. The satyr says, that does it. I can no longer be friends with someone who blows hot and cold. Now, the story is interesting for several reasons. Clearly, the satyr and the man share a language and a milieu. They live near each other out in the country. The physical differences might explain the satyr's final reaction. We gather he's not as sensitive to the cold as the man is, and we also assume that he probably doesn't eat cooked food all that much. He describes in concrete or literal terms what we have retained as an abstraction or as a figure of speech. His question is proto-scientific. He treats the man's mouth as an alien or alienating appliance. It blows hot and cold. The oddest thing is that we have retained the satyr's viewpoint. He does blow hot and cold, but we take that as a figure for describing certain kinds of people. You can see a version of that of our sometime relationship with the satyr or proto-satyr. If you take a quick look at the most uncanny painting at the Norton Simon Museum, look at the animals' faces and take a look at the feet. But let me get to our protagonists, Galileo Galilei and Giambattista Guarini. You'll note that they're about a generation apart, with Galileo being the younger figure. Guarini is best known for the Pastor Fido, or Faithful Shepherd. She composed from 1581 to 1584. It was performed very lavishly in 1585. Manuscripts circulated everywhere with some differences, but it first finds its way into print 1589. It's immediately attacked, and the quarrel that it generated was almost as good as the work itself. Galileo and Guarini never referred directly to each other in their correspondence with friends. And this is odd in that they had many mutual friends. They were both associated, albeit in different years, with the University of Padua. They were both in the same academies at the same time. They were both associated with the same courts and the same benefactors, and they're both deeply involved in the world of music. I don't know how to explain this at present, but I will note that many of Galileo's works, and I'll focus on a few today, have either direct or oblique allusions to the Pastor Fido or to the quarrel that it generated, or his correspondence will appear to be talking about a particular work, and there will be a gratuitous allusion to the Pastor Fido. Why should that be? The Pastor Fido generated an awful lot of publicity. You can see that it appeared in most European vernaculars very quickly, and in rival translations within one same language, and in dialects. Supposedly it was performed in the New World in 1601. And even in 1760, Voltaire is complaining that the Pastor Fido is the ultimate export, whereas no one has heard of Shakespeare. Times change. Now, spoiler alert, here's the plot of the Pastor Fido. The Arcadians have to make an annual sacrifice of a virgin to the lunar goddess Diana for a past offense. And an oracle says, this will come to an end if you can get two Arcadians of semi-divine parentage to marry each other. And it looks like this should be Silvio and Amorilli. But Silvio is only interested in hunting, not in marriage with anyone. In the meantime, he's vigorously pursued by the nymph Dorendo. You see an image of that here. And here in the background, you can see him talking nicely to his dog on the left, whereas Dorendo is trying to get his attention. And in the foreground, he tells her, go away, I'm not interested. I only want to hunt. Now, Amarilli, the other semi-divine inhabitant of Arcadia, loves and is loved by Mirtillo, who is a shepherd from outside of Arcadia, but she has to pretend otherwise because of chastity and decorum. The person who gets the drama moving is Corisca, a decadent woman from a city outside of Arcadia, and the satyr is most interested in her. And they have great lines between them. I will talk more about this famous image on the right in just a bit. But Corisca, the wanton one, is interested in the faithful shepherd Mirtillo and decides to get rid of her rival Amarilli by getting Amarilli and Corisca's own former lover Corydon to enter a cave together and be discovered, and then the nymph Amarilli would have to be executed because of this tryst. But it turns out that Mirtillo enters that cave. The couple is discovered and they're without blame, and the shepherd Mirtillo offers himself up in Amarilli's place to be sacrificed. And here he's on the verge of being sacrificed when suddenly his father, Carino, arrives from outside Arcadia. And questioning reveals that he's only the adoptive father, that in fact Mirtillo is from Arcadia. He floated away in a flood 19 years earlier, and his real father is about to execute him. So the conditions, these conditions fulfill the oracle. Amarilli and Mirtillo can get married, and in the meantime, in the most embarrassing of scenes, Silvio has accidentally wounded Dorinda, and the dog on the right is correct to look away from this scene. It's a small wound with only a little bit of loss of blood, and in fact, it feels pretty good to Dorinda. So that couple too is going to marry. And the tragic comedy ends with these marriages. We see no more of the satyr, but Cariska promises to mend her ways. Now, on the face of it, this doesn't sound very much like any kind of astronomy or measuring or instrumentation, but there are a lot of traces of some kind of connection between astronomy and the Passero Fido in later editions. So for instance, in 1654, we had 2 editions where the faithful shepherd is holding a Galilean telescope. In 1693, John Dryden is describing a double plot where you have an important storyline about a pair of lovers and then a secondary pair of lovers. And he compares it quite gratuitously to the Copernican world system, where he says the moon is carried about by the motion of the earth. And he makes his point about Guarini and the double plot there, as if it were familiar to his audience. And in 1754, we have a work of, we would call it science, ascribed to Metastasio, was actually just dedicated to him, but it's written in the form of a pastoral, so subjects taken up there are the satellites of Jupiter, gravity of bodies and their attractive forces, the nature of sound, and it has all the literary conventions of a pastoral. And in 1766, finally, there's a series of street peddlers where you see an astrologer or an astronomer, sort of a city slicker, with a telescope, and he looks like he's seducing a country girl, some sort of naive from a rural background. If you look closely, he is connected with the satyrs and with goat-like men. So what I'm trying to do is fill in the blanks in between and explain it in terms of Galileo. Galileo had many tragicomedies in his library. He had also their predecessors, literary predecessors, which I've marked with an asterisk, and he also had some critical works about the quarrel. One way of bridging the distance, the cultural distance between early modern tragicomedy and astronomy and measurement is to look at the 3 genres that fed into this early modern development. The first would be the satyr play. There was at that point only one extant satyr play, Euripides' Cyclops. Now there's about 1 3/4 of one extant, and there are hundreds of fragments. So we knew, as did early moderns, generally about what satyr plays did. The Cyclops, the giant, Polyphemus, is obviously concerned with scale. And in this satyr play, he lives on an island and he has enslaved some young satyrs. They take care of his flocks, and also their father, Silenus, who takes care of his cave, does the housework, and is also his sex slave. In the Odyssey, as the tale is told, there are no satyrs, and Odysseus and his men end up on the island. They are trapped by the giant Polyphemus. They get him drunk, and then they rig up a burning stake of olive wood torqued by Odysseus's men to blind the giant and to escape. In the satyr play, the satyrs are involved. They're very enthusiastic about the invention to blind the giant, but at the crucial moment, and you'll see them there depicted with horsetails in this early version, at the crucial moment, the satyrs back out, as Odysseus knew they would, and they say, well, we can't really contribute, but we know some nice charms and dance steps to help accomplish this mission. This is very typical of satyr plays from what we can tell of the fragments, they're always about inventions and discoveries that come in from the outside. The satyrs are always intrigued, but generally incompetent with the new development. You can see an engraving by Rubens for a treatise on optics, in which these angels and their very sober tutor look like a cleaned up version of the satyrs and their drunken father. They are doing a dissection of the eye of the Cyclops and are completely rational and deliberate in their movements. You can also see in this engraving that the satyrs are interested in anamorphosis, where a distorted image is on the table and it's made upright and proportional in this cylindrical mirror. Satyrs were associated with elephantiasis, or the unnatural enlargement of legs and of the genitalia, since Galen onwards and through the early modern period. So here you would say, yes, they're interested in optics, but they're looking at or for the wrong thing. They're motivated by the wrong thing. Our second genre that feeds into the early modern tragicomedy is the term itself. It emerged first in Plautus's only mythological play, the Amphitryon. And it concerns the relationship of the audience to the protagonist. So Mercury in the prologue comes on and says, I'll tell you about the tragedy. The audience groans, no, not another tragedy. He says, it's fine, I get it. We'll mix it up, half tragic, half comic. He says, but since it has a slave as a character, let's call it a tragicomedy. And in this image on the right, you'll see the gist of the plot. There's a general named Amphitryon who has to go off to war, and he leaves behind a beautiful wife, Alcmena. Jupiter falls in love with her, wants to spend the night with her, disguises himself as Amphitryon, and in fact impregnates her with Hercules. Mercury, Jupiter's son, disguises himself as Amphitryon's own slave, Sosia. So in the scene on the right, the real Sosia is approaching and wants to go to the house and would disturb the tryst. So the fake Sosia, Mercury, convinces him that he's the genuine article, and whoever this other Sosia claims to be, he's wrong, he's made a mistake. The third genre, pastoral, is very easily connected with astronomy, particularly if we look at the reigning pastoral Virgil's eclogues. And this image is from the third eclogue, where two shepherds are quarreling with each other about who's the better singer. And they make a bet, they wager something. And one says, I'll wager a pair of beechwood cups. One has carved on it Conon, the astronomer, and who was that other fellow? And he describes an astronomer who he can't name. Now, critics ever since have said, who is it? The consensus seems to be that it is Conon's friend, Archimedes, and that Archimedes' name cannot be mentioned because it wouldn't scan correctly. But the connection overall of the eclogues with astronomy was so strong that this conventional scene from the first eclogue is on the title page of Galileo's ghostwritten work on the new star of 1604. So in the upper left, you see Tityrus underneath the beech tree and his friend Meliobaeus, who's departing because his land has been seized by the government and is going to be given to a soldier. So you always will see this kind of setup, and you can see it in abbreviated format on Galileo's astronomical work. The way he connected it to the eclogues, which were dialogic, was as follows. What he's interested in showing is the place of the new star. Conventional astronomers would have said, nothing changes in the heavens above the moon. Therefore, this new star must be below the moon. Galileo uses the issue of parallax to disprove that. And he has his rustics climbing up in trees show that they are more learned than the philosophers in Padua. So parallax would work like this. If you were somehow at A in the center of the world and you could look at C, the moon, you would see it against the background D. But if you were at B and you looked at that same moon, you would see it against E. Therefore, the parallax there is DE, that arc. And in general, you would say that the closer the object to you and the further it is from that background, more parallax it shows. So what Galileo does is he has one rustic stay on the ground and the other one climb trees and do sightings. So first he climbs the tree at A, and he's asked to look at the tree that I marked with the red arrow and describe it against its background. He says, well, it's to the right of that big house. Then he climbs up tree B. Holy moly, it's moved. It's to the left. It's to the other side. Then eventually he goes back to tree A and he looks at some small shrubbery very close to that house in the background. He looks at it from A and B, and it's in more or less the same place. So let me look at some specifics that generated this polemical afterlife of the Pastor Fido, and also changed the course of early modern tragicomedy. In the prologue, which was spoken by the river guide Alpheus, he says, my Arcadians are rustic, but they're still cultured. Some of them spied out the secrets of the heavens, others were hunters, and others actually killed menaces to the community, boars and bears. And immediately that produced an uptick in the kind of knowledge that was ascribed to shepherds or rustics in general in tragicomedy. So we have the example of celestial knowledge, as in Galileo's treatise on the new star of 1604, but there's also other gadgets, cooking with concave mirrors and the like. And the one that I want to look at right now is a scene involving detailed and up-to-date medical knowledge. So someone is wounded in this particular tragicomedy of 1605, which Galileo owned. And this nymph comes up and says, the wound is on the lower right side of the thorax, barely penetrating the cavity of the chest, but with considerable laceration of the flesh and muscles, 4 finger breadths in width. On this account, I am hopeful, even though I haven't been trained in blunt trauma and I haven't read all these books. I'm just a simple maiden and I'll concoct something. And it's an odd moment in the tragicomedy, a complete change in tenor. All of these figures are real, and the books that she hasn't read are in fact real. You'll recognize one name, Fallopio, as in fallopian tubes. The name after that, Acquapendente, was a good friend of Galileo's, a prominent physician and anatomist, and still living. The name that should tip us off, among other things, that this is kind of a spoof, is Julius Pollux, who was a sophist from the 2nd century CE. And he didn't practice medicine. He wrote a kind of thesaurus that put together the types of vocabulary you would use in different disciplines. And he has one on medicine, where all the medical terms, or most of them, come from comedies, as it turns out. The maiden continues, one must thus make haste, in the meantime this guy is bleeding out on the ground, to gather fir balsam, bitter melon, hypericum, tobacco, snake root, and other items that we will find. This should give us pause. She's making haste, she says, and she names 2 items that come from the New World, tobacco and snake root. And then she goes into a long song and dance about how the wound isn't serious, therefore she is not really going to worry about his possible death. Now, this isn't so much a commentary on female medical knowledge or vernacular knowledge, though there were those in tragicomedies. It's a kind of a spoof, and the sensation that we might have is akin to something we would have in this visual instance. It's a fine manner engraving, and the more you look at it, the stranger it seems. We notice after a bit that all 4 protagonists are satyrs. And if we look at the attending physician, it's a female satyr. She's wearing glasses. And while initially you think she's doing something like removing a thorn, the suggestion is that she is in fact changing the configuration of his humanoid feet so that his feet look more like hers. So let me look at three instances in the Pastor Fido that have direct connections to Galileo's work. I'll start first with Corisca's hairdo or hair don't. You can see in the image on the right, this is an ivory carving of 1639 by a German. He had spent the early 1630s in Italy and was familiar with the Pastor Fido, and he shows the satyr in a harrowing scene where he pulls the hair of Corisca. Finally, she squirms out of his grasp because she's wearing a wig, and he falls over. This is a very neat work of art in that it catches that moment before he falls. This whole scene was much imitated and much discussed by critics. They asked, was it her real hair? Was she bald afterwards? Did she have another wig at home? Do our wives and daughters do their hair like this? Was this hairpiece her own or a horse's hair? Would you really fall over flat on your back if you pulled off someone's wig? And among other images, there are two by Galileo's friends. And the most interesting one is by his friend Artemisia Gentileschi from 1639. And I'll return to it in a bit. But you would say, well, what does hair have to do with astronomical works? Well, we know that comets mean literally long-haired stars, and occasionally they're depicted as if they were long tresses. We also know that there's a sometime quasi-constellation named by Archimedes' friend Conon, whom we met in the third eclogue, named the locks of Berenice, Coma Berenice. But what Galileo has in mind is something different. He, like many of his peers, believed that all stars were of the same size, but they had, especially with a bad telescope, a kind of aura around them, kind of rays that encircled them. If you could get to the true size of the star, you could judge its distance and maybe even use two that were close together to judge whether or not the Earth had annual revolution. So he always talks about shearing the stars of their hairpiece, of their wig, of their locks over and over again, both in the Latin and the vernacular throughout his career. And it's especially interesting in this connection to look back at the most famous title page of the Pastor Fido, where you see at the bottom Corisco in a cameo appearance. On the left, you'll see the river god Alpheus. On the right, you'll see the satyr with his back to her. In the middle, you see Corisco running away, presumably with her hair torn off, but a star in its place. Now, Venus and Diana, of course, come up in this and other tragicomedies. In general, they don't get along. They're completely opposite. The image on the left shows Venus showing her two cupids, her two children, the moon, and they seem to be mocking it or her. The image from the Pastor Fido, they seem to be getting along, or at least have a temporary truce, but one is all about hunting and chastity, and the other is all about love and lack of chastity. Galileo is interested in the relationship of the moon and Venus for another reason. If you look at the central image, you'll see that if Venus did encircle the sun, then it would have phases like the moon. But if you look at the images at the top and the bottom, you'll see that if it is behind the sun, it will always be what appears a fully lit orb, varying in size as depending on how close we are to it, or as a side-lit sickle if the sun is behind it. So Galileo waits until he can observe with his telescope this phase pattern, and he sends out a coded message, Quintiae figuras emulator mater amorum, which we might translate the mother of love, that is Venus, imitates the shapes of Cynthia, that is the moon. We might badly translate it, but more in line with this tragicomedy. The mother of love rivals or emulates the manners of Cynthia, or in sanitized in a neutral scientific idiom, Venus has phases like the moon, i.e. she orbits the sun. And for this reason, it's also interesting that there's a tragicomedy that Galileo owned in which the moon, that chaste lunar goddess, speaks the prologue, and it's surprising to see, she's called Delia because she's from the island of Delos. Within her second sentence, the second line, she refers to desirous, kulpidioki. And she says, you won't recognize me. I've come to earth. I've taken away my bright horns. I'm completely different in my face and in my manners. I've come to follow the footsteps of love here. She's interested in Endymion. She says, I'm hanging up my quill, I'm baking my bows and arrows. So we might say, by way of synopsis, in this early case, the moon imitates Venus rather than the other way around. Now, the case of instruments and measurements is more complicated, and I want to take a longer look of it. It is clearly related to astronomy. So in the image on the left, you'll see an astronomer, but in the background, he has instruments that he's used for measuring things close by. And the suggestion is that those exact same techniques and practices are what he uses to observe stars and measure their distances in that globe, which shows the south celestial pole as far away as you can get. Or in this treatise on the right, you can see that Pythagoras and Archimedes are evoked here. Pythagoras' theorem here, and you can see his triangle, he says is worth the sacrifice of 100 oxen. Archimedes is saying that give me a place to stand and I'll move the earth, but that's not really pertinent for this treatise on geometry. What's more pertinent is his pi r square, or the area of the circle relative to a triangle, and the volume of the sphere relative to a cylinder. Those come into play in this treatise. Basically, though, if you look at the tools involved, they are a trickle-down effect from astronomical tools where you're measuring shadows and setting up congruent triangles, or sometimes measuring the angles on them. Eventually, as in this instance, this English instance on the left, you stop talking so much about shadows and use more familiar terms to us like sine, cotangent, and the like. Now, Galileo himself invented a sector and was very protective of it. He taught its use to various European noblemen, and it had two basic functions. It had special scales on it, something like a slide rule, that would allow you to compare the relative densities of different materials, or to convert types of money, or to figure interest. But at the same time, it's also a sighting instrument. And so you can use it by holding it up to the eye and measuring angles and calculating distances. And because he was protective of it, and because those scales differed with the demands of the user, he only circulated information about it in manuscript, and he didn't want it copied. But that information did get out, and his instrument was copied. So to protect himself, he published a vernacular version of this treatise. It was translated very poorly into Latin by a group of 3 men. It made Galileo, he made him look like an idiot. And it also faulted Galileo's treatise for not disclosing certain things about what exactly you would see when you looked through the sight lines on this instrument. Now, Galileo took the youngest of these 3 villains to court. And that's what the difesa is, his defense of himself. It reads very much like a satyr play, and that's in part circumstantial. This youngest villain was named Capra, which means goat. And you can see an instance of his handiwork up there in the upper left, an equilateral triangle where the 3 angles are 61 degrees each. Galileo had a lot of fun with that. But Capra's name means goat. He's very young. He described his own life in print as a tragicomedy. And the place where the theft took place was at a friend of Galileo's, where rustic comedies had been performed for decades. The publisher of Galileo's defense also enhanced this connection by putting in a printer's emblem that had been drawn from a famous version of Sanazzaro's Arcadia. For this reason, I was especially interested in the treatises regarding this type of instrument that both Galileo and Capra looked at and did not always acknowledge. And one I found very interesting from 1598. It has a satyr's head at the top, and I assumed that this was merely decorative. I started reading the letter where the writer thanks the author of this treatise, Ottavio Fabri, for a prototype of the instrument. And he says, well, I'm very sorry that I can't recall much of the geometry I studied as a young man. He doesn't go on to say, but your instrument and your treatise brought it all back to me. Instead, he says, I can write you some lovely poems, and I have. As it turns out, Guarini, the author of the Pastor Fido, is the dedicatee of this treatise and holds this measuring instrument. His poem is interesting because he compares Fabri favorably to someone who happens to be buried in Syracuse in Sicily. And what he's evoking is Cicero's finding of the tomb of Archimedes in Syracuse. And I'll return to that motif in a moment. But overall, it is still counterintuitive. Why would treatises and instruments devoted to measurements and proportions be connected with anything that involves the satyr Silenus and Bacchus? Because they're all about lack of proportion, about extravagance, about the lack of discipline. But still, the more I looked at the treatises, the more I would see satyrs on title pages, and then doubled on astrolabes. And then on the image on your far right, that's a model of a solar orb in a Ptolemaic system held up by a satyr. It was owned by Galileo himself. At first, I thought, well, there's a connection in that satyrs are often associated with nets. So in this engraving, for instance, this satyr has trapped one nymph too many with his net and is now being tied up to the tree. You can see the net off to the left. And in this image, the baby satyrs are hauling their drunken father Silenus ashore with the net. And of course, there is a satyr play called The Net Haulers. In this image on the left, it's just sometimes ascribed to Titian and would be about 1510. You see two satyrs lounging next to an oversized astrolabe. It, like them, is hybrid in that it is part abstract and like a tool, and in part pictorial. But if you look at a net, and I have a magnificent example from the Huntington here on the right from 1608, the net on an astrolabe is not rectiform like we imagine a net, but it is a series of curving lines to point out important stars or sometimes celestial circles. If you look in the foreground of the image on the left, it seems that those satyrs have torn off the net. They have discarded it from their astrolabe. But still, it seemed to me too narrow. So I was very happy to find a wonderful article in the HLQ by Anthony Parr, in which he shows that Father Time was not always pictured with an hourglass, but sometimes as a satyr. And this would represent deep time, unmarked time, time before all of these people used their devices to calculate time and space, a time of antiquity. You can see then that there are other images. Parr's examples are all English, but here on the far left, you have an Italian example of Truth, the daughter of Time, being crowned by victory. She's got her foot on her father's thigh. He is Father Time, and he holds a small sickle. In the middle, you see a Flemish example of a very depressed-looking satyr, Father Time. And on the right, you see a kind of division of labor. Death with its sickle is coming for one of the lovers, and the satyr is coming for the female protagonist here. In general, I would connect this image of Father Time as a satyr with the Arcadians' own belief that they predated the moon. They say that they, and this was said of them, that they could remember a period before the moon existed. So that sounds like the height of naivete, but it also suggests a long-term investment in astronomy, even before one of the principal features and markers of time, the moon, existed. So for that reason, I decided to take seriously all the satires that kept cropping up in these treatises on measurement. In one that particularly interested both Galileo and Capra, every time there's a promise of a disclosure about enhanced vision with this sector, the writer says, well, actually, the manuscript was unclear here, and he punctuates it with this satyr motif. In general, they start out, most such treatises, looking pretty normal. But as they progress, you see the measurers assume less and less dignified and more dangerous positions. In the image, the orange image on the right, in fact, you can see someone perched on a dome, and he's also stark naked. In general, the further you are from your target, the more likely you are to be working naked. And this will correlate loosely with a forerunner to these kind of literary work where you have choruses of naked shepherds. The nakedness often indicates your distance from the thing you're looking at. So in the instance on the left, the middle space is very clearly articulated. You can read very easily that there's a change of landscape there, a boat. The image on the right is less clear, though there is a boat there. And so that distance is indicated with unclothed measurers and protagonists. Now, Fabri, for his part, did not suggest that you go out into the country in 2s or 3s and 4s all naked. What he insists upon is that you work alone and you take measurements from different sites. But because you are alone and out in the country, you can be stark naked when you do these measurements. In general, the more the treatise tells you that you're out in the country, the more likely the figures are to involve naked and spotted figures or countrified protagonists doing your work for you. Our image of Truth with her foot on the thigh of Father Time comes in the middle of a treatise of great interest to Galileo, in which in the first book, a fortress is described and its measurements and how far you can be from it and how you can besiege it. And in the second one, and that was within a city and a permanent fortress. In the second one, it's more earthworks. And so that fortress will melt back into the earth. And the hinge between the two books is this very emblem with Father Time. When you look at the description of triangles, before you adopt the instrument and hold up any instrument or measure anything, you have satyrs emerge. You can see there in this image on the left, the satyr in its characteristic pose, and the image at B, the figure at B, he holds an instrument, but I think nonetheless, he is also a satyr if you compare his profile to the classic profile of the satyr. In this treatise, where you are dividing the pretty irregular shape generated by a shadow, a tree shadow onto the ground, you're generating into more manageable polygons. The three figures there, the one on the ground with the stake, the kneeling figure, and the sort of sexually ambiguous one in the tree with the pole, are borrowed from an earlier legal treatise about how to divide up the fruits of a tree that happens to be on 4 different property lines. But you can see that both works borrow from the Bacchanalian Arcadian tradition and give abbreviated versions of the figures celebrating Bacchus in his parade with satyrs. So what I want to look at here is one of 4 tragicomedies written by Galileo's friend and enemy, the great Aristotelian philosopher Cesare Cremonini. And in this late one, you can see the satyrs in the background. And what is at stake here, and this is a very common sight in tragicomedies, is an abyss or an abeme, because they're usually set in mountainous areas, and also because shepherds are either threatening to throw themselves into an abyss, or it looks as if they have fallen in, or their clothes are found there. How is this setting treated in treatises on measuring distances and depths? You can see that generally it's something like a well, sometimes an abyss, and you use standard techniques for working out what is the distance to the surface of the water, how big is the well if you cannot go to the other side, or the valley. My argument would be that what Cremonini wants to evoke here is Cicero's discovery of Archimedes' tomb at Syracuse, which I mentioned earlier. And basically, that is a monument to partial knowledge as preserved by other monuments. Cicero tells us that he figured that Archimedes had been buried at Syracuse, and the Syracusans said, who is Archimedes? We never heard of him. Certainly don't know of any such grave here. Eventually, he finds it because he knows that it is meant to have on it a sphere and a cylinder. He finds the thing covered with brambles. He gets local peasants to cut the brambles away. And what Archimedes was so proud of was the relationship of the sphere to the cylinder, 2 to 3, or another way it could be written is the relationship of the cone and of the sphere would collectively equal that of the cylinder. Cicero tells us that he remembered certain lines of poetry and that he found these lines half eaten away on the tomb, but he doesn't disclose the lines. So everywhere there are gaps in knowledge. And these come up in Cremonini's description of a site, an abyss on the mountainside. So first, a baby satyr tells us that the Sibyl took us to her room and it was covered over with branches. Inside of the room, there was something beautiful black marble incised with golden characters, but it doesn't tell us what they say. And that beneath that, in an area he doesn't see, is something underground, some underground structure. The area he does see is small. It's no wider than would be the squared area from this evergreen oak to that juniper there. The same space comes up when the villain is talking to himself. He says he was walking along. He finds the space completely covered over with brambles. With a strange light, he tears the brambles away and enters into a space beneath which is a circular room of some sort. A den down there. He describes that room as that subterranean room as large as if one were to sweep out a circle from that last oak to the first laurel tree. And then he says at the end, in a chilling way, with this rope, I'll drop down those 2 nymphs right down into the cave. It must be 30 arm lengths deep. And then with an evil laugh. That same site is described at least twice more. Cicero basically affirms that there's a round opening of some sort at the top and 30 arm lengths in depth. And the Sibyl says she lives in the upper part and you can't get to the lower part except through her antechamber. What I think we are meant to imagine here is clearly something like Cicero's discovery of the tomb with all the brambles and that kind of undisclosed or partially disclosed message, and that we're meant to imagine something like a cone. We don't know if that lower room is the end of a tapering cone or a sphere. But basically, we're being asked to compare what the satirists describe as a small square area and what the villain describes as a large circular area. And the reason that is pertinent and is connected to Archimedes is that when he is describing pi r squared, he says that the area of a circle will be equal to a right-angled triangle whose base is equal to the perimeter of the circle and whose height is equal to the radius. And he wants to describe these areas as exactly equal. So the way he does that is by comparing a circle to a square and imagining first that the square is within the circle and enlarging the square to an octagon and then to a 16-sided polygon and so on, till he gets to a contradiction in terms. And then he goes back and describes the circle on the inside of a square and does the same technique till he gets the same contradiction in terms, so that it is neither larger nor smaller. They must be exactly equivalent. And we do get one specific measure, that 30 arm lengths. And for that reason, we could work out what these areas are, because we know what these angles must be in this idealized example. I don't think that is Cremonini's point so much, that we compare specific measurements, but rather that we go through the motions of something like one of these treatises on measurement. In other words, he's suturing together these two genres. What's interesting to me about this genre is its constant escapism and then its disclosures and its destruction of its own fiction. So we can count up those that have been discarded along the way, the fiction that we live in harmony with nature, that discovery and invention have only pleasant, happy consequences, that we are much more invested in romantic love than in civil warfare, that transgressions are mild, they're amusing, they contribute to a happy ending, that punishments are mild, and they don't have any kind of cumulative force or damage, that work and play are pretty much the same, and that despite all the hierarchies about gender, about who is divine and who is semi-divine and who is not, or who owns a lot of property, a lot of sheep, and who does not, that all are basically contented with their lot and all needs are met. Clearly, all of this is discarded within this literary tradition. For that reason, it's very interesting to look at the graphic development of the satyr. That motif that we see so common, two satyrs and a vase, turns out to be the satyrs are chained to a vase, and sometimes these chains are euphemized by curling ribbons and by symmetry in general, but increasingly you see the satyrs bound, not just chained, but with their arms, let's say, behind their backs, or they're bearing up heavy loads, or they're sort of working with appliances. This tallies with the still very current, very useful notion of Aristotle about slavery. Instruments, he said, are of various sorts. Some are living, other lifeless. The servant or slave is a kind of instrument. The servant or slave is an instrument for instruments. He who by his nature is not his own, but another's, is by nature a slave. He has also derogatory things to say about shepherds. But if we look again at the depiction of satyrs, you'll see them over the course of the next century more and more often holding up heavy things and working in the guise of a kind of instrument. You'll also notice that the satyr in this engraving of 1640 does the heavy lifting, all the work with the tools of an architect and of a sculptor, of his own self-depiction, but he is ordered about by another, by painting. So he's complicit in, but not totally in control of his own self-representation. And literally what the painting, the figure of painting is resting upon is something sculpted on his orders by the satyr. You'll also see the increasing racialization of the Silenus figure, particularly in processions involving Bacchus. This is a late 16th century example, not just racialization, but sexualization, as in this instance, deriving from Rubens, and not just racialization, but exoticization, as in this 17th century instance, or to return to Artemisia Gentileschi's encounter of Corisca and the Satyr. This was painted when Artemisia was in Naples, which had an immense slave market. And it had also an immense market of sex slaves, of prostitutes. And slaves at that time and earlier were generally shorn of their hair, male slaves were. So this wig would be of interest both to him and to a prostitute. It is a kind of currency that passes between them. And the look on their face as they address each other is not at all typical of the usual Corisca and Satyr encounter. In other words, there's something here in sociological and historical conditions that overwrites what we know of the drama. So what relevance does this have for Galileo? Well, it tells us, as we would suspect anyway, that the practice of astronomy, which you can see pictured here on the left, is the domain of leisurely, elite, well-educated, moneyed men, and that all other activities fall to women and to lower class men, and both are urged to be diligent and industrious, but the group on the left looks somewhat less so. Or you can see in this case someone who has abandoned the field. You can see he's left those tools down and is now practicing measurement and astronomy. It takes a whole village here to support that activity. When astronomy comes not to an end, but astronomical activities are certainly curtailed, at least in the way of courtly support, when all of Europe becomes wrapped up in a confessional war after 1620, the emphasis shifts to those measuring instruments that Galileo and others worked upon, and how valuable they would be to gunners in particular, setting up sieges, and also to those who were maintained within towers. The example on the right, the English example, is also unusual in that usually you don't have the protagonists pictured when they're getting shot at. You just have the instruments themselves. Here you have actual men being shot at from the turret. So the problem, as it's laid out above, is both a mathematical problem and a real daily life problem. So we could say, we look again at this Arcadian setting here, and you see it in the lower right. That is the scene of the first eclogue, of the man beneath the beech tree and his friend departing because his land has been requisitioned to give to returning soldiers. We can see that every Arcadian setting lies above a landmine. Thank you very much. Hope to see you in Q&A.
Thank you for an amazingly rich presentation. Can I just encourage the audience out there to use the Q&A function to populate some questions? But I'll take the chair's prerogative first, Eileen, by asking about what you think the direction of flow is between the two sets of genres that you've been discussing here. You seem to be suggesting that the idioms and images of tragicomedy flood into the literature on measurement, and at the same time the idioms of measurement, the techniques of measurement, are ubiquitous in the tragicomedy. So what is the nature of the causal relationship between those two phenomena, or is this not causal?
I think, can you hear me?
I can, yeah.
Yeah, okay, good. I think that there's a back and forth. I think that Guarini's work was the one that really got everyone's attention. In the meantime, prior to that, there were a bunch of not excellent ones, but Galileo had them in his library, and there are a bunch that follow. So there is a kind of constant interchange. And so Cremonini whom I talked about, he's famous because, I mean, he was famous then. He made twice the amount of money that Galileo did. He was really famous Aristotelian. They were both fingered by the Inquisition together in 1604, early. And Venice protected them and didn't send them to Rome, just kind of stalled. But so he and Galileo are good friends, I think, drinking buddies and this and that and the other, but they don't see eye to eye at all on natural philosophy. And he's famous for not engaging with Galileo because when the telescope came out, he said, I'm not going to look through that thing. It's mind altering. And so today he's remembered for that. But he engages with Galileo quite a bit in his 4 tragicomedies. So there he talks about things like, does the moon and do the moon and the earth resemble each other? Or how does a dark room work? Or this thing on measurement. So there is a little bit of catching up in real time. I think for Galileo's part, I don't think he was influenced by tragicomedy at all in terms of scientific content. But I think he, you know, had his views. He had to say what he wanted to say about, you know, Venus or stars or whatever, but that he knew the available idiom would be literary, that most people wouldn't have a telescope, and they certainly wouldn't have a telescope like his, and that he would need to make them feel welcomed and, you know, able to contribute on other grounds. And so that he chose this among other things. So, I mean, there are tragicomedies. There's an awful one that is interesting in that it has a bunch about sunspots. And it's in 1627 when sunspots are kind of tapering off. But there were still some seen, and in fact, some have just been discovered in manuscript. And so the pastoral itself is just terrible. It's just painful reading, but it does kind of enroll some recent sciencey natural philosophy stuff in it, woodenly, among that sunspots.
Okay, so thank you. The argument then is that Galileo, needs to use a familiar idiom or genre to engage his audience, and chooses this particular one. But you, in an aside a moment ago, said amongst other strategies or amongst other things. So what other parallel idioms or parallel techniques or parallel genres was he also using simultaneously?
Well, at the same time, he really likes, for instance, romances. So he really likes the Orlando Furioso. So he'll quote quite a bit from that. He likes and occasionally gestures towards Virgil. And if you look at Virgil's eclogues and the Georgics, you would say there's real astronomical knowledge here. And occasionally, even now, say a modern historian of science can look at some work from antiquity and say, you know, in fact, this poem about, you know, the sun's darkened face really must be dated to this year, because in that year where the poet is writing, there would have been totality for this eclipse and stuff. And you can sort of mine these texts, occasionally biblical ones, but less so, for bona fide astronomical information. And I think that, you know, Galileo would do that for Virgil, but by and large, it's a way of saying, I'm one of you. I'm not just some, you know, astronomer type.
Right.
There in the quarrel over the Pastor Fido, there's this very popular reaction to it that says, you know, this is garbage. It's very kind of wooden in its analysis, so much so that I think it's a joke. And one of the criticisms of it is to the author, look, this should be analyzed by poets, criticized by poets,
not by, I don't know, mathematicians and astronomers. So it's a kind of a direct hit, stay in your own lane kind of thing.
Right. Can I ask you about your method? I mean, the range of images that you showed here is absolutely extraordinary, and there's clearly been exhaustive reading and scrutiny of those images. How do you track them down? Are there any shortcuts that you use, or is it literally volume by volume, plate by plate, and then very close looking?
No, I'm astonished all the time at the things that I don't recognize right away, or that I only see when I juxtapose them. Well, I use certain websites from certain museums that are really, really helpful, but there I'm dependent upon how well they've labeled something.
Right.
So for instance, I was looking at this, that one image where they have the Satter family exoticized with dark skin and in this kind of tropical setting and like a leopard or something that they're holding. And I was looking at that Dutch artist who did it. And I've found, well, I sort of vaguely knew, but I hadn't attended to the fact that he had been in Rome in the 1620s. And there he and his brother had done these sort of paintings of Dutch artists living it up in a Roman tavern. And in the background is one of those satyrs as Father Time scrawled on the wall as graffiti. It also scrawled on the wall as how much wine they have drunk, and there's various stuff. So they're kind of showing their, the way Dutch artists do their good times in Rome kind of motif. But it did have, I think, in a satirical way, that satyr as Father Time in the corner. And they didn't label it as such, but you could see it's satyr with a sickle back in the corner. So yeah, I just have to look at these things repeatedly, and a lot of times I don't realize until later.
Right.
Or I feel that that there's probably a more direct route. Let's say that in terms of engraving, let's say that the people who are engraving these treatises about measurement are also doing stuff for plays.
Right.
And so they redeploy, and that could well be, and they redeploy
Right.
the same kind of background. And so it's just there. It's basically a story about materials and economics and stuff. And it could be, but I hope it's more than that.
Well, it strikes me that it's much more than that in light of what we've heard from you this evening, rather than just these things being recycled for business reasons. Can you take us back to the first time you noticed satyr imagery in these texts, and whether it registered then, or is it something that you've only come retrospectively to recognize the force of?
I didn't, when I was in grad school, we didn't have to read Pastor Fido, but I remember we had to read a kind of a forerunner of that in some course about Italian drama. And I remember saying to the teacher, but this is just woodland kink. And she was kind of appalled. But, I just thought it's just so goofy and so escapist and all of that. So no, it was not the genre I was looking for. But one time I was reading something, some exchanges with Galileo and a friend of his who was, literary, but interested in, I don't know, buoyancy or something. And out of the blue, the guy rehearses some lines about Coriska and the satyr. And it seemed to have no connection to what they were talking about. And then I went back on the guy's correspondence, and he keeps bringing in plays and vignettes of plays, and this is like a tragedy and blah, blah, blah. And so I thought, well, it's a kind of an inside joke, and I just don't get it. But I kept noticing this pattern. And then I thought, well, I really have to go and read the Pastor Fido. And so there you go.
I see. Yeah. So there's a question here from our mutual friend, Jim Chandler. The connection of astronomy and myth, he says, is already there in the naming of the planets after Roman gods. Did Galileo have views about that? did he think there should have been a more rational naming practice for the heavenly bodies, or was he good with the mythic system?
Thanks to him. He was good with the traditional names. Occasionally, he will corrects Capra. If Capra doesn't know, a lot of times a constellation, let's say, will have 2 different names, or 3, or even 10, let's say, and one's in the vernacular, in that faux Paduan vernacular. So he will sometimes correct someone and say, yes, but this is this, you know. He knew all the names in various poems. No, he wasn't like, there are a lot of people who turned to constellations they Christianized them.
Huh?
It's completely goofy. But he loved all of that. And he would drag in a literary reference to, the constellation, let's say in Latin poetry, whenever he could, in order to sort of enhance his point. If an enemy did it and said, we know that the planet Venus is like this because so-and-so Catullus says this in his poetry, then he'd go, look, don't you understand that's poetry? This is science, or this is natural philosophy. And so he was a bully, basically. He would use whatever means were at his disposal, but in general, he liked the literary aspect. And also, last thing I'll say about this is the Galileo was very interested in painting. His closest friend was a painter. He wrote a lot of criticism of painting, and he advised a lot of painters. He lent some painters some money, and on and on. He bought a lot of stuff, and he attended an Academy of Design. So for that reason, he was very familiar with mythological representations of heavenly bodies.
Interesting, thank you. So my closing question is about the shape of the project and its likely time scale. So how are you going to bring this all together as a book, presumably? Is it going to have hundreds and hundreds of images, as you've shown us this evening? I'm interested in what the narrative strategy will be.
Well, I'm hoping that my fellows can help me with this. Because initially I thought, well, I'll just sort of trudge through the works in which references to the Pastor Fido crop up, but they're not all of equal size. They don't fall into neat chapter-like units. I've got to find a different way, and they're not all equally interesting, and some of them can be sort of explained very quickly. There's a punchline, you get it, and then it's over. So I have to think of another way of configuring it. As for the images, I don't know. That's a problem with most publishers. But no, this is just for the sake of a talk.
Right, understood. And what a wonderful talk it was. Thank you so much, Eileen. Thank you, everybody, for joining us this evening. We look forward to welcoming you back to our next Distinguished Fellows lecture, which is by Professor Jim Chandler next Thursday, the 28th, on the theme of Frankenstein. So we'll see you all then. But thank you for joining us this evening. Please join me in thanking Eileen Reeves.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.